November 7th, 1943. The air above northern France had that hard metallic chill only late autumn war can bring. A thin cold that cut through flight suits and bit into the fingers behind leather gloves. Somewhere below, gray fields and winding hedgerows blurred into one another, their silence deceptive. Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358 Fighter Squadron, 355 Fighter Group watched the fuel gauges of his Republic P-47D Thunderbolt sink toward empty. The needles were trembling near zero. Hours earlier, the mission had gone wrong in ways no map could have predicted. Brutal headwinds screaming across the channel, engines burning gallons faster than any chart allowed, and enemy flak thick enough to taste in the air. He had crossed into France with hope and firepower. He was now alone with arithmetic, distance, altitude, and a vanishing line of fuel. Inside the cockpit, the noise was both deafening and lonely. The R-2800 engine's deep growl filled the world, its rhythm steady, hypnotic, the heartbeat of home. Until even that began to sputter. Roach glanced at his map, then at the pale line of clouds toward the northwest. England lay somewhere beyond them, safe but impossibly far. He adjusted the prop lever, leaned the mixture, trimmed the nose for glide. The instrument needles wobbled like dying compass hands. Ahead, through the plexiglass canopy smudged with oil, he spotted what looked like salvation. A small airfield tucked among the patchwork fields, its runways clean, its hangars neat, the pattern of order he had seen hundreds of times on Allied bases. For a heartbeat, his mind told him it was friendly territory. For another heartbeat, he stopped questioning it. He called out on the radio. No answer, just the dry hiss of static. He tried again. Still nothing. The fuel pressure dropped to zero. He felt the first shudder of silence as the big radial coughed. There was no time for indecision now. He lowered flaps, eased the gear lever down, felt the mechanical whine as the hydraulics strained for one last duty. The P-47, nicknamed Beetle, came down heavy but obedient, skimming the hedgerows, the prop spinning slower and slower until the wheels kissed the grass. He rolled out on sheer momentum, breath locked in his chest, the horizon steady at last. Relief flooded through him, until he saw what the relief was hiding. The ground crew truck that approached looked ordinary at first glance, olive-colored, purposeful. A man in coveralls waved him forward. Roach followed the signal, coasting slowly. Then something began to itch in his gut. The vehicles were too square, the helmets wrong, the rifles, slung over shoulders that did not look American. He glanced left. On the wing of the parked fighter nearby, a dark, angular cross gleamed beneath the overcast. Not the star and bar of home. The Balkenkreuz. In that instant, the illusion shattered. The men were shouting now, running, rifles raised. One jumped onto the wing and slammed a gloved hand against his canopy. His mouth formed words Roach didn't need to understand. He froze. The canopy latch clattered open. Cold air poured in, carrying the smell of mud, oil, and foreign voices. Hands dragged him out, quick and professional. His sidearm was gone before he realized they had taken it. Boots pressed against gravel. The German sergeant's breath steamed in the air as he barked an order. Somewhere a camera clicked. Not for memory, but for evidence. Lieutenant Roach's war as a combat pilot ended there, in the quiet between heartbeats, on a runway that had looked like safety. Within minutes, officers in black leather coats surrounded the plane. One of them circled slowly, eyes narrow with calculation. "Nicht beschädigt," he muttered, "not damaged." Another called for a guard detail. Soldiers unspooled wire around the aircraft, drove stakes into the frozen ground, and covered the Thunderbolt with tarpaulins. The efficiency chilled him more than the wind. This was not a victory scene. It was an acquisition. He was escorted toward a waiting truck, flanked by two guards whose rifles never wavered. Behind him, His airplane stood alone under the gray sky, its propeller motionless, the last warmth of its engine fading into the November cold. The truck jolted onto the dirt road, tires crunching over gravel. Through the slats, he saw the airfield shrinking away. Hangars, fuel drums, the painted crosses receding into mist. He had flown hundreds of hours over enemy territory and never imagined his war would end not in fire, but in stillness. As the convoy wound north, he felt the strange dislocation of a man watching his own story change course. Prisoner now. The world narrowed to the rattle of the truck and the hum of a language he could not read. Back on the field, the Germans moved with a deliberate reverence. Mechanics drained the tanks, logged the serial numbers stamped into the engine mounts. 42-22490 Beetle. Photographers walked slow circles, snapping each angle, careful to preserve even the mud spatters. Intelligence officers scribbled notes, already drafting the report that would travel to Berlin before nightfall. The capture of an intact P-47 Thunderbolt, a fully operational example of the newest American high-altitude fighter, was no trivial headline. It was a gift from fate, a window into the industrial heart of an enemy they struggled to comprehend. By dusk, the aircraft was shrouded and guarded by sentries posted at every corner of the wire. A lieutenant placed a placard on the propeller hub with stenciled letters. Beuteflugzeug number 1307. Captured aircraft number 1307. In the fading light, its olive-drab paint turned the color of dusk itself. Somewhere far away, Allied pilots still roared across the channel, unaware that one of their own machines now slept under German custody. For the Luftwaffe's technical command, this was more than a trophy. It was a revelation. They had shot down Thunderbolts before, wrecked and burning in fields, but never taken one whole. The prospect electrified their engineers. Telegrams shot through headquarters circuits that night. P-47 Thunderbolt intact. Transport to Rechlin requested. In offices lit by green lamps, analysts debated what secrets the heavy American fighter might yield. Turbo supercharging, fuel injection, high-altitude performance. To the German high command, these were questions worth entire laboratories. In a war where every kilogram of fuel, every gram of alloy mattered, understanding how America could build such monsters in quantity was as valuable as capturing a city. Meanwhile, Roach's journey continued eastward through a landscape scarred by occupation. Villages passed in silence, windows shuttered, church bells long forbidden to ring. At every checkpoint, the guards presented papers stamped with the eagle and swastika. He noticed the fatigue in their faces, the weariness behind the discipline. Even in enemy hands, he could see it, the weight of a war turning against them. By the second night, he reached a rail depot, where other captured airmen waited under floodlights. One offered him a cigarette without a word. They all stared at the same sky, the same pale moon crossing over lines that no longer meant anything. Back at the coastal airfield, a flat car was being prepared. Engineers removed the P-47's wings, wrapped them in canvas, and secured the fuselage with wooden braces. The smell of oil and paint mingled with the cold sea wind. A crane lifted the massive fuselage onto the railbed. Chains tightened, clamps groaned. A colonel watched with his hands clasped behind his back. "It will go to Rechlin," he said. "They will want to see what the Americans are made of." Someone laughed quietly, not mockery, but disbelief. None of them had ever seen an aircraft built with such abundance of metal, such excess. Where their own machines bore the marks of rationed steel and desperate welding, this one looked carved from wealth itself. The train departed before dawn, its whistle echoing through the coastal fog. Inside a covered freight car, the Thunderbolt began its long passage toward the heart of the Reich. Along the route, curious workers lifted tarps to glimpse the prize. "Donnerbolzen," one murmured. "Thunderbolt." Some spat, some crossed themselves. To them, it was a symbol of the skies they no longer controlled. Lieutenant Roach, miles away in a prison convoy, could not know any of this. He sat against the truck wall, counting the hum of the tires, thinking of the squadron still flying, of his airplane still warm somewhere behind him. In that silence between knowledge and ignorance lay the strange symmetry of war. A man captured and a machine revered. By the time daylight broke over northern France, both were on parallel journeys into the heart of enemy territory. One toward a barbed wire camp at Barth on the Baltic Sea, marked Stalag Luftwaffe, the other toward Rechlin Lärz, the Luftwaffe's secret cathedral of machines. There, in laboratories walled by pine forests and secrecy, the Germans would begin to peel back the layers of American engineering, bolt by bolt, bearing by bearing. And somewhere in the ledger books of war, another line would be written, one that measured not courage or victories, but the transfer of knowledge bought in blood and steel. That night, the Rechlin Command received the teleprint. Transport of P-47D Thunderbolt expected within 72 hours. Condition, excellent. Pilot captured alive. The clerk who typed it could not have guessed that this single entry would ripple through the corridors of German industry for months to come, nor could he know that decades later, historians would look back on that November evening and see the quiet birth of an understanding that the might of modern war no longer lay in bravery alone, but in the ability to build endlessly, to supply endlessly, to replace endlessly. For now, the airfield returned to its gray silence. The tarpaulin over Beetle fluttered in the wind like a flag of surrender, though the aircraft had never surrendered. It had simply run out of the one thing no nation could manufacture fast enough: time. And somewhere, in the cold barracks of a temporary holding camp, Lieutenant William E. Roach lay awake, listening to the distant rumble of trains heading east, unaware that his airplane rode one of them. A captive ambassador of American industry, rolling through the night toward a future where wars would be decided not by men in cockpits, but by the factories that built them. The journey from the occupied coast to the interior of the Reich took 3 days and nights. Freight cars clanked through fog-drowned valleys and frost-silvered forests, the steel wheels echoing across bridges that had once carried summer tourists north toward the lakes of Mecklenburg. Now they carried the anatomy of war. Beneath tarpaulins tied with hemp rope, the fuselage of the captured Thunderbolt shuddered with each turn of the rails, chains biting into wooden braces. Sentries rode the flat car, rifles across their knees, boots coated with coal dust. To them, it was not an airplane but an artifact, a secret too valuable to trust even to comrades. At dawn on the 3rd day, the train slid past the frozen shore of Lake Müritz. Mist drifted above the water like breath. Beyond the pines, a cluster of hangars appeared, gray, geometric, windowless. Signs warned Geheim Kommandosache, secret command matter, the Rechlin Lärz proving ground. Here the Luftwaffe had dissected every weapon its enemies had ever built. Spitfires, B-17S, Yak-9S, even fragments of a Mustang, but never a complete Thunderbolt. The flat car halted beside Hangar 5, the engineering hall reserved for foreign aircraft. A crane's cable creaked as workers in blue overalls guided the fuselage from the car to a wheeled cradle. A major from the Technisches Amt signed the papers of transfer, his breath forming clouds in the cold. Unbeschädigt, vollständig intact, complete. He circled the nose, tapped the cowling, lifted a panel, peered into the dense weave of pipes and wiring. So bauen sie Flugzeuge, he murmured. So this is how they build airplanes. By afternoon, the tarps were removed, and the Thunderbolt stood naked under the white light of the hangar. The olive-drab paint was streaked with salt. The American insignia had been replaced by the black cross of the Luftwaffe, and on the fuselage mechanics brushed fresh codes in yellow. T9 plus FK. The mark of Circus Rosarius, the Luftwaffe's evaluation and demonstration unit. A photographer walked slow circles, clicking the Leica's shutter. Each angle would be printed, filed, analyzed. Hauptmann Hans Werner Lärz arrived just before sunset. Short, neat, quiet. His reputation among test pilots was legendary. He had flown everything from captured Hurricanes to Soviet La-5s, logging hours in machines most men saw only as contrails. Yet when he stepped into the hangar and looked at the Thunderbolt, even he paused. "Ein Monster," he whispered. A monster. Not with fear, but fascination. He climbed the ladder to the cockpit. The seat was broad, the instruments numerous, arranged with a logic unfamiliar to German eyes. English labels in stenciled white letters marched across black dials. Oil temp, turbo RPM, mixture auto rich. He ran a gloved finger over the throttle quadrant, felt the precision of its detents. Automatic mixture control. He noted aloud, automatic propeller governor. Automatic boost regulator. Each word was both admiration and unease. In German fighters, pilots controlled everything by hand, adjusting mixture, prop pitch, supercharger gear, all by muscle memory. Here, the machine did it itself. It was, he thought, an airplane built by engineers who trusted systems more than men. For 2 days, Lärz studied it like a scholar approaching an alien text. He and his mechanics mapped every hydraulic line, traced the path of the turbo ducting that ran like metallic arteries under the fuselage, counted every access panel, dozens, each secured by quick-release fasteners that opened without tools. They weighed armor plates, cataloged ammunition feeds, disassembled a wing root to expose the Browning machine guns. 8, he said, astonished. 8 heavy guns. The crew chief nodded grimly. Their own FW-190 carried 4. On the morning of the 3rd day, Lärz decided to fly. Outside, snow flurries swept across the runway, fine as salt. Mechanics towed the Thunderbolt into position, its radial engine still cold, breathless. Fuel from 200-liter drums sloshed into the wing tanks, the smell sharp and metallic. One of the crewmen handed Lärz a checklist written in English. He tucked it into his flight jacket, glanced once more at the American data plate riveted to the sidewall. Republic Aviation Corporation, Farmingdale, New York. A small plate, a whole continent behind it. The starter cart coughed to life, sending compressed air through a hose into the engine's starter unit. Lärz primed the fuel, set mixture to auto-rich, cracked the throttle. A pop, then a deep churning rumble rolled through the hangar like thunder underwater. Smoke billowed from the exhaust stacks, gray turning to blue as cylinders caught. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 awoke. 18 cylinders firing in perfect cadence, each explosion muffled and musical. The floor trembled. Men grinned despite themselves. They had never heard an engine like it. Less shrill than their Daimler-Benz 603s, more like a locomotive's pulse. Ein Herz aus Stahl, someone murmured, a heart of steel. Lärz taxied toward the runway, feeling the weight of the machine through the pedals. It was immense. The tailwheel swung lazily, the nose blocking his forward view. He advanced the throttle slightly. The torque pulled right, steady and predictable. Instruments quivered. Oil pressure good, manifold steady. He lined up on runway 2, released the brakes, and eased the throttle forward until the prop blur turned invisible. The roar deepened. The Thunderbolt began to roll. Acceleration was not dramatic. It was a building force, relentless, patient. 50 meters, then 100. The tail rose. The control stick grew light. At 140 kilometers per hour, the ground blurred into motion and suddenly fell away. The P-47 was airborne. For the first few minutes, Lärz kept the climb shallow, hands alert for instability. The controls were heavier than any German fighters, yet smooth. He trimmed the elevator, felt the nose settle. Below 5,000 meters, the Thunderbolt seemed sluggish, exactly as reports had claimed. But as he climbed higher, the character changed. At 6,000 meters, the turbo supercharger came alive. a faint metallic whine rising behind him as exhaust gases spun the turbine buried in the tail. The manifold pressure needle, which should have been falling with altitude, held steady. He advanced throttle to combat power, and the aircraft surged forward as though kicked by a giant. He grinned. "Jetzt beginnt es," he said softly. "Now it begins." At 7,000 meters, over 23,000 feet, the air thinned to glass. Most German engines suffocated here, their power drained by physics itself. The Thunderbolt, however, still pulled hard, the turbine singing higher. Speed 420 miles per hour. He banked left, felt the inertia like a pendulum but perfectly stable. The cockpit temperature dropped, frost forming on the canopy edges. Outside, the horizon curved in pale blue silence. He realized with a start that this ungainly monster could fight comfortably where Messerschmitts gasped for breath. He tried a dive. Throttle back, nose down, airspeed climbing. 450, 480, 500 miles per hour. The stick stiffened, compressibility pressing back against him, but the structure held like carved granite. At 520, he pulled gently. The aircraft responded slow but sure, no vibration, no buffeting. When he leveled off, he was laughing inside the oxygen mask. Few machines had ever made him laugh. Back on the ground, the engineers swarmed him with notebooks. Rate of climb? Turbo response? Control stiffness? He answered each calmly, then paused. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have misunderstood this airplane. It is not meant to fight low. It is meant to fight where we cannot follow." That sentence would echo through reports for months. For the rest of the week, Lärz flew the Thunderbolt daily, refining his impressions. He noted that the cockpit ergonomics favored endurance. Wide seat, heated air, excellent visibility above the wingline. He praised the radio system, clear even at altitude, and the autopilot controls, unknown luxury in a single-seat fighter. His verdict was simple but damning to German pride. The Americans built machines to relieve the pilot of everything but fighting. Germany built machines that demanded every ounce of the pilot's skill just to stay alive. Each evening, mechanics examined the airframe for stress. None appeared. The turbine blades showed no warping, the engine no measurable wear. Oil samples gleamed clean. The technicians exchanged glances that mixed admiration and despair. This was reliability beyond their reach. In the mess hall one night, Lärz was asked by an engineer what he thought of the P-47 compared to the FW-190. He considered, then replied, "The 190 is a rapier. The Thunderbolt is a hammer. At 20,000 feet, the hammer always wins." Reports traveled quickly to Berlin. The Technisches Amt compiled the findings into a 30-page dossier marked streng geheim. It concluded, "The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt demonstrates exceptional high-altitude performance due to exhaust-driven turbo-supercharging not presently feasible in German production. Structural strength and pilot protection exceed all current Luftwaffe standards. Recommend tactical caution at altitudes above 6,000 meters." Copies were dispatched to Jagdgeschwader commands across Europe. Yet, for all their precision, the numbers could not convey the feeling Lärz had when the machine lifted through the cloud tops. When he realized that the American war effort had harnessed not just engineers, but entire industries to produce power on such scale. It was more than a fighter. It was an industrial statement, a flying manifesto. When he shut down after his final flight, the R-2800 idled with a deep, satisfied thrum. He slid back the canopy and listened. The sound of that engine was unlike any other, neither refined nor delicate, but confident, indifferent, unstoppable. It sounded, he thought, like a factory breathing. As mechanics wheeled the aircraft back into Hangar 5, snow began to fall again over Rechlin. The flakes hissed against the cooling cowling, melted, vanished. Lärz pulled off his gloves and pressed a bare hand to the metal. Warm still. alive still. He felt for the first time that Germany might lose not because its pilots were outflown, but because its enemies could build machines like this by the tens of thousands. In the quiet that followed, a secretary in the observation room typed the closing line of the day's report. Testing complete. Recommend further disassembly and metallurgical analysis. The typewriter clacked once more, then fell silent. Outside, the night swallowed the airfield, and in the hangar the captured Thunderbolt waited for its next ordeal. Not the skies, but the scalpel. The morning of November 14th, 1943 began with frost on the hangar roofs and a silence that felt almost sacred. Rechlin Lärz had seen hundreds of aircraft pass through its gates, some triumphant, others broken, but few inspired this kind of anticipation. Engineers gathered beside the P-47, notebooks in hand, as Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche prepared for another series of high-altitude test flights. The previous week's results had unsettled them. The Thunderbolt's performance figures contradicted years of Luftwaffe doctrine. It was not supposed to do what it had already done. Fuel lines hissed, gauges flickered, and the big radial engine came to life once more with that same locomotive thunder. The hangar doors slid open. As the aircraft taxied out into the cold morning, one of the younger mechanics muttered, "If this thing were German, it would take a factory just to maintain it." The older chief shook his head. That's exactly the point. They have the factory's Lerche's logbook entry that day would later read simply, Flight Number 7, Turbo and Dive Characteristics. The words were small. The meaning was immense. He took off into a pale blue sky streaked with thin cirrus clouds. From the first moments of climb, he could feel the difference. Steady power, unwavering pressure, the sense of an engine unconcerned by altitude. At 5,000 meters, the propeller still bit the air with full authority. At 6,000, the turbine behind him began its subtle metallic song, a continuous whine rising like a ghost. By 7,000 meters, the air was thin enough that a man's breath condensed inside his mask with every exhale. Yet the Thunderbolt surged forward as though it were still flying at sea level. The altimeter needle swept past 8,000, then 9,000. Finally, at 10,000 meters, over 32,000 feet, Lärch leveled off. Outside, the horizon curved faintly, the world below reduced to blue haze and silver rivers. He advanced the throttle. The manifold pressure held steady. The aircraft responded with calm inevitability, pushing through the thin air like a machine immune to physics. True airspeed, 425 miles per hour. Fuel flow normal. Oil temperature stable. For a German pilot raised on the temperamental personalities of inline engines, this was sorcery. His Messerschmitts gasped for breath above 6,000 meters. Their superchargers screamed, their spark plugs fouled. The P-47 simply continued, indifferent to the sky. He rolled into a gentle turn, noting the stability. Even with its weight, almost twice that of a Bf-109, it held its line like a rail-bound train. Then he tried something few dared in test flights, a high-speed dive from extreme altitude. Nose down, throttle to idle, airspeed climbing. The wind clawed at the canopy, a low moan building into a shriek. 450 miles per hour. 480, 500, 520, 530. The altimeter wound downward like a clock losing its mind. Compressibility began to whisper through the controls. Stiffness, resistance, but the airframe did not tremble. He pulled gently. The stick was heavy, almost immovable, but not impossible. The wings held. The dive flattened. Level again at 10,000 feet, alive. He exhaled a laugh into the mask that no one heard. Later he wrote, "This aircraft dives like a stone and survives it." Our machines tremble at such speed. This one does not. Back at Rechlin, the analysts gathered around as he climbed down from the cockpit. They recorded his words carefully, translating them into columns of data: altitude, manifold pressure, Mach number, recovery load. But beyond the numbers, there was a new tone in his voice, a quiet respect tinged with dread. "The Americans have built something we cannot outfly," he said. "We can only outthink." That single sentence became the unofficial thesis of German technical intelligence for the rest of the war. Over the next week, they ran controlled comparison tests between the Thunderbolt and their own fighters. On paper, the FW-190 still held the edge in climb and low-altitude maneuverability. But at 20,000 feet, the equation reversed. The P-47 maintained full combat power. The German engines faded like exhausted lungs. In dives, the difference was catastrophic. The 190's control surfaces stiffened to paralysis beyond 480 miles per hour. The Thunderbolt remained manageable at 520. The engineers who watched the recording said it felt like comparing 2 centuries of technology. In one meeting, a senior aeronautical engineer, Professor Otto Mayer, spread a diagram across the table, showing the flow of exhaust gases through the P-47's turbo supercharger system. "It is not genius," he said softly. "It is abundance. They waste heat because they can afford to. We economize because we must." No one argued. Meanwhile, pilots on the front lines continued to underestimate the aircraft. Reports from the Channel Coast still described it as sluggish, clumsy, easy to evade. Rechlin's analysts now knew how wrong that was. They issued a confidential memo to all Jagdgeschwader units. Avoid combat with the Thunderbolt above 6,000 meters. Do not attempt pursuit in steep dives. Engage only at low altitude or from superior position. The memo circulated quietly, but its implications were explosive. Germany's faith in the pilot as the decisive factor, the idea that skill could overcome material disparity, was beginning to fracture. Here was proof that industrial power could design a machine that nullified human advantage. Each new test only deepened that realization. The more they flew the Thunderbolt, the more it refused to break. The landing gear endured violent touchdowns without bending. The electrical systems functioned flawlessly after hundreds of cycles. The armor plate showed no deformation even after deliberate gunfire tests at close range. Engineers who had spent years designing aircraft balanced on the knife edge of weight and performance began to grasp that the Americans had escaped that equation entirely. They built not to the limit of materials, but to the limit of production. If something broke, they built another. If it was heavy, they simply made more power. It was industrial philosophy turned into aerodynamics. By December, Rechlin's workshops had filled with fragments of the Thunderbolt's story, cross-sections of its fuselage, photographs of its wiring looms, metallurgical samples from its propeller hub. Each told the same tale: precision through mass production. Even the rivets were uniform, perfectly aligned, each one identical to the next. In a nation where aluminum was now rationed by the gram, the sight of such abundance felt surreal. Late one night, Lärz walked alone down the line of captured aircraft: Spitfire, Lightning, Mustang, and finally the Thunderbolt. The others looked elegant, almost human. The P-47 looked industrial, impersonal, like a machine designed by a nation of factories rather than artists. He placed a hand on its cowling and felt the faint warmth still lingering from the day's test run. "You are not beautiful," he whispered, "but you will win." That realization spread quietly through Rechlin's community of engineers. They had entered the war believing precision and discipline would compensate for scarcity. The Thunderbolt made them face the opposite truth. Abundance itself was a form of genius. By the end of the month, every technical bureau in the Reich possessed copies of the Thunderbolt data. The results were clear. The P-47's R-2800 engine maintained 2,000 horsepower at altitudes where the BMW 801 managed half that. Its service ceiling exceeded 40,000 feet. Its dive speed approached the transonic barrier with no structural failure. And perhaps most importantly, it could absorb punishment that would have destroyed any German fighter in the air. The final Rechlin summary closed with a line that read like an epitaph. The P-47 Thunderbolt represents not only superior technology, but a different concept of war. It is not built for a pilot. It is built for a system. Those words traveled from Rechlin to the Reich Air Ministry, where bureaucrats filed them under technical evaluation enemy aircraft. Few understood that they were reading the future. In the months that followed, fragments of the Thunderbolt's influence seeped into German design programs. Turbo supercharger prototypes for the Ta-152, reinforced dive structures for the Do-335. But none could be realized. The resources were gone. The Allies were bombing the factories that would have built them. The knowledge remained trapped on paper, brilliance without steel. And so, the aircraft that had been captured by accident began to haunt the engineers who studied it. It was not merely a machine. It was a mirror. It reflected everything they could no longer become. When Lärz took his final flight of that winter, he climbed once more above 30,000 feet, leveled off, and looked west. The horizon glowed faintly, the direction of England, of the factories that never slept. The radio crackled with static. He turned the Thunderbolt for home, descended through the clouds, and realized that no report, no memo, no warning could change the arithmetic of the war now unfolding. The Thunderbolt was not invincible, but the world that had built it was. By December 1943, the snow around Rechlin lay in thin, hard crusts, crunching under the boots of guards who patrolled the hangar perimeter. Inside, the air smelled of oil, cold iron, and anticipation. The Thunderbolt, code T9+FK, stood under floodlights at the center of Hangar 5, its olive-drab paint dull beneath the frost-white glare. The flying had ended. Now the cutting would begin. The engineers entered in silence, their breath forming small clouds. They wore white laboratory coats over gray uniforms. Pencils, calipers, and notebooks hung from pockets like surgeons' tools. The aircraft was positioned on heavy wooden blocks, panels removed, propeller still attached. Its vast radial engine loomed like a heart exposed for autopsy. The chief engineer, Oberingenieur Karl Heidkamp, raised a hand. "We treat it as we would our own. Every part must be catalogued before it moves." His voice echoed against the curved walls. They started with the cowling. The bolts came free without resistance. American thread forms, clean and uniform, none stripped, none cross-cut. "Look at this machining," a young assistant murmured. "Every edge deburred." Heidkamp nodded, jotting a note. "Production discipline. Perfect." When the cowling lifted away, a collective exhale filled the hangar. The Pratt and Whitney R2800 lay bare. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 perfect rings, copper lines running like arteries, each junction labeled in English. The engine gleamed as if polished for display. Even after weeks of testing, no oil seeped from the joints. "Impossible," someone whispered. "It should leak somewhere." But it didn't. The Americans had achieved the kind of tolerance German mechanics could only reach by hand-fitting each part. Here, it had been done by the thousands. One engineer climbed onto a stepladder and peered into the supercharger housing. He traced the ductwork with a gloved finger, following it through the firewall and back toward the rear fuselage. "It's a complete ecosystem," he said. "Exhaust drives turbine, turbine drives compressor, compressor feeds the engine, self-regulating, automatic." He tapped the pressure regulator the size of a coffee mug. "And this? It thinks for the pilot." The turbo assembly came out next, lifted with chain hoists and laid on a padded bench. Its turbine wheel, blackened from heat, spun with a whisper when nudged. The metallurgist examined it under a magnifier, eyes wide. "Nickel alloy." High chromium content. We can't make this anymore, not without imports. Heidkamp made another note. Strategic material. Unobtainable. Nearby, a mechanic disassembled one of the 50 caliber Brownings. 8 of them had been lined along the wings, each with electrical heating elements running through the feed chutes to prevent freezing. He laid the components in order on a linen sheet. Barrel, bolt, feed powel, recoil spring. Every piece was stamped with serial numbers that matched perfectly. They build these like spark plugs, he said. All identical. A German armorer nodded, envy plain in his voice. We hand-fit every MG-151. They could swap these guns between airplanes without adjustment. At another table, technicians sectioned pieces of armor plate. Sparks hissed as the saw bit through the metal. The cross-section revealed multiple layers, hardened steel backed by resilient sheet. See how it bends, not shatters, the metallurgist said. They've balanced strength with ductility. We use brittle plate to save weight. They refuse compromise. Hour by hour, the aircraft came apart. The cockpit canopy lifted free, its glass nearly an inch thick, laminated and flawless. The seat followed, solid cast aluminum, heavy enough to anchor a boat. Then the control panel, a forest of wiring harnesses bound by color-coded looms. The electricians stared. This is not assembled, one said softly. This is manufactured. Heidkamp looked over his shoulder. There is a difference, and it may cost us the war. By midnight, the Thunderbolt resembled a skeleton. Ribs of aluminum alloy, spars exposed, the floor scattered with components tagged in brown paper envelopes. Photographers moved through the haze of acetylene smoke, recording each stage. Every screw removed was logged, every bracket weighed. The Germans documented their own defeat one part at a time. 2 days later, the metallurgical laboratory presented preliminary findings. The report, still warm from the mimeograph, bore the Reich Eagle at the top and the words, Streng geheim. Inside were lists of compositions. Aluminum silicon alloys, chromium molybdenum steels, heat-resistant valve materials. Each was followed by a grim annotation. Not available in current Reich supply. Even the bearings contained trace elements, copper, silver, vanadium, that Germany could no longer secure. The technicians exchanged looks of disbelief. They build engines as if resources were infinite, one said, because for them, they are. The discovery cut deeper than pride. It exposed the widening gulf between ideology and industry. For years, the Reich had preached that discipline and genius could outmatch quantity. Standing in that laboratory, surrounded by the evidence, no one believed it anymore. In the armament bay, another revelation awaited. The ammunition belts lay coiled like serpents, each cartridge identical, brass cases polished, primers uniform. Tests at the firing range confirmed perfect reliability. Out of 3,400 rounds, not a single misfire. The report noted dryly, U.S. ammunition demonstrates manufacturing tolerance within 0.02 millimeters, unachievable under present conditions. Beyond the data, the engineers wrestled with something less tangible. The Thunderbolt's design philosophy defied their instincts. Every German machine they had ever built sought elegance through precision, efficiency through scarcity. The P-47 embodied a different creed, reliability through redundancy. Where they economized, the Americans reinforced. Where they simplified, the Americans automated. It was as though two civilizations had solved the same problem with opposite answers, and only one could afford its own logic. One evening, Heidkamp stood alone beside the stripped fuselage. The floor was littered with metal shavings and oil-stained cloths. The hangar lights hummed softly. He rested a hand on the bare frame where the pilot's seat had been. Through the open window, he could hear distant trains moving north, perhaps carrying coal, perhaps carrying the wounded, perhaps both. This, he said quietly to the empty air, is why we cannot win. Later that week, officers from the Reich Air Ministry visited Rechlin to inspect the progress. They were shown trays of components, labeled photographs, and test summaries. The presentation was meticulous. At the end, one colonel asked, "Can we reproduce it?" The room fell silent. After a moment, Heidkamp answered, "We could if we had their aluminum, their fuel, and 10 years without bombs." No one laughed. Back in the hangar, the disassembled Thunderbolt waited like a monument to that truth. The smell of solvent hung heavy. Engineers continued to measure, to weigh, to document, but the mood had changed. The work no longer felt like conquest. It felt like archaeology. They were studying a civilization more advanced, not in genius, but in capacity. A civilization whose strength was not the brilliance of individuals, but the coordination of millions. In early 1944, when fragments of the engine were shipped to Berlin for further analysis, a clerk recorded the transfer with bureaucratic precision. One turbo supercharger, serial P-384412. Condition: excellent. He stamped the form, unaware that he was filing away one of the quiet turning points of modern warfare. The moment when the men who prided themselves on mastery realized they were servants of scarcity. That night, as the lights went out and the guards locked the doors, the hangar settled into darkness. The faint ticking of cooling metal echoed like a clock. Snow pressed against the windows. Somewhere far away, the factories of America roared on through another night shift, stamping pistons, forging crankshafts, building engines faster than Germany could count them. The men at Rechlin did not know it yet, but the sound of those distant machines was already writing their future. By January 1944, the dissected remains of the captured Thunderbolt had already begun to travel through the Reich in the form of typed pages and photographic plates. What had arrived at Rechlin as an airplane was leaving as information. Hundreds of measurements, alloy analyses, airflow charts, and annotated cross-sections. Each document carried the same heading stamped in purple ink: Technische Beurteilung, P-47D Thunderbolt, USA. To the men who received them, these reports were both revelation and obituary. The first summaries reached the fighter commands in France, the Low Countries, and Western Germany. They were read in drafty offices lit by blackout lamps, where squadron adjutants traced the neat German script with numb fingers. Avoid combat above 6,000 meters. Do not follow in steep dive. Fighter exceptionally resistant to gunfire. The words looked harmless on paper, but to pilots who lived by altitude and aggression, they felt like a confession. The Reich had lost the upper sky. At Abbeville, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Bohm of JG-26 received one such bulletin. He was 22, already a veteran. He read the paragraph twice, then folded it into his flight log. "If they say don't climb with it," he told his wingman, "then we stay low." 2 weeks later, he did just that, diving on a Thunderbolt formation at treetop height, scoring hits before escaping under cloud. It worked once. The second time, the Americans came down after him, their 8 Brownings carving the air to ribbons. His Focke-Wulf exploded over the dunes. His comrades found only fragments. The report had been correct, but understanding is not the same as salvation. In Berlin, the Technisches Amt tried to translate technical awe into tactical logic. Charts compared the P-47 to the FW-190 and the new Bf-109G6. Ratios, climb curves, power-to-weight figures. On the walls of conference rooms, the numbers looked manageable. On the production lines, they meant despair. The Reich was building barely 1,800 aircraft a month of all types. The United States was approaching 7,000. Ford's Willow Run plant alone could produce more engines in a week than all of Germany's dispersed factories combined. What Rechlin had discovered in the hangar, abundance, was now measurable in every statistic that crossed a bureaucrat's desk. The tactical memoranda turned into field lectures. At bases from Caen to Cologne, Zirkus Rosarius pilots demonstrated captured enemy machines. When Lärz himself flew the yellow-painted Thunderbolt over Fassberg that spring, hundreds of Luftwaffe personnel watched from the frozen grass. The aircraft climbed, rolled, dove, a heavy beast made graceful by sheer power. When it landed, the silence was uneasy. One Oberleutnant broke it. "If they can build 10,000 of those, why are we still here?" No one answered. For the propaganda ministry, the lesson was unusable. To admit admiration was to admit weakness, so official newsreels continued to portray the P-47 as a flying milk bottle, slow, cumbersome, vulnerable. Yet among pilots, the myth died quickly. They had seen the demonstrations, and they had fought the real thing. Its dive was unstoppable, its armor impenetrable, its endurance inhuman. The frontline joke became bitter. Shoot the pilot, not the plane. Meanwhile, the analysts at Rechlin kept compiling comparisons. Every new Allied bomber raid supplied further proof. Thunderbolts appeared as escorts higher and farther than expected, their turbochargers glowing red in the thin air above 30,000 feet. German radar operators began marking a new symbol on their screens. A dense block of returns that arrived with the bombers and refused to leave until the last fortress turned home. Protective wall, one observer called it. Iron umbrella, another. Whatever the term, its meaning was simple. The Luftwaffe could no longer reach its prey. The tone of internal memoranda shifted from technical to philosophical. A colonel in the Air Ministry wrote privately, "We know why we are losing. We can describe it in horsepower, in tons of aluminum, in men per shift, but we cannot change it." He was right. By spring, the shortages were crippling. Fuel diluted with benzol, engines assembled from recycled metal, flight training reduced to hours instead of months. The Americans, meanwhile, treated airplanes as consumables. Factories replaced losses faster than German clerks could record them. The idea of war as a contest of machines had become a contest of industries, and only one side was industrial enough to play. When Zirkus Rosarius took the Thunderbolt to show units on the Eastern Front, Soviet liaison officers watched the demonstration in silence. One later remarked, "If the Germans fear it, we will welcome it." Within weeks, Lend-Lease P-47s began appearing in Soviet markings, further proof that the world's resources had shifted beyond the Reich's reach. At Rechlin, the engineers continued their measurements out of habit. They plotted fatigue curves, cut tensile samples, photographed stress fractures that never appeared. But the spirit of inquiry had turned elegiac. Every discovery about the Thunderbolt's durability reminded them of what their own factories could no longer produce. The materials they analyzed were not just metals. They were prophecies. Chromium meant trade routes, nickel meant colonies, aluminum meant electricity. All things Germany was losing by the day. Hans Werner Lärz felt the change most acutely. Each flight in the captured aircraft deepened his admiration and his melancholy. "It is not invincible," he wrote in his diary, "but it is inexhaustible. Its strength is that there will always be another one." When Allied bombers finally struck the outskirts of Rechlin that summer, he watched from the runway as smoke drifted over the pine forest. The irony was brutal. The men who studied Allied machines were now being destroyed by them. Through the winter of 1944–45, fragments of the Thunderbolt's lessons appeared in new German designs. The Ta-152's pressurized cockpit, the Do-335's heavy structure. But all arrived too late. The factories that might have produced them were rubble. The engineers who once measured American alloys now scavenged scrap aluminum to patch roofs. Reports still circulated, stamped Geheim, but the recipients were offices that no longer existed. In March 1945, as the Red Army advanced into Mecklenburg, the order came to destroy all sensitive material. At Rechlin, they burned stacks of photographs and test data, but the aircraft itself remained intact. There was no fuel to move it, no explosives to spare. So the Thunderbolt, its paint faded and its markings half-washed by snow, waited quietly among other ghosts. A Mustang, a Spitfire, a yak, all mute witnesses to the empire that had tried to understand them. When Allied troops entered the base in May, they found the hangars open, paper scattered, tools frozen in place as if time had stopped mid-experiment. In one corner sat the disassembled P-47, its wings propped against the wall, its fuselage streaked with rust but otherwise untouched. The soldiers who discovered it hardly noticed. To them, it was just another wreck. They could not know how many nights of study and sleepless arguments had been spent over those bolts and valves. Among the surviving documents was a single-page summary dated February 1944. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt combines unprecedented mechanical endurance with high-altitude performance. Its production scale renders tactical countermeasures insufficient. Industrial capacity must be considered the decisive weapon of this war. That sentence, preserved by accident, was perhaps the most accurate assessment written by the Luftwaffe during the conflict. It described not only an airplane, but an era. The consequences of that realization would outlive the men who made it. After the war, when American and British investigators toured the ruins of Rechlin, they marveled at the thoroughness of German research, the neat photographs, the meticulous notes. One officer remarked, "They understood us better than we understood them." Another replied, "Yes, but too late." In a crate labeled Beute Flugzeug number 1307, they found fragments of the Thunderbolt's cowling, still bearing traces of yellow paint and the faint outline of a black cross. Someone chalked 3 words on it before it was shipped home: knowledge without power. May 1945. Rechlin lay silent beneath a low, colorless sky. Smoke drifted over the pines from a village still burning to the east. The roads were choked with carts, bicycles, and soldiers without direction. Germany's final migration, from certainty to surrender. For years, the proving ground had pulsed with the sound of engines. Now it was the sound of boots on gravel, papers flapping in wind, the brittle crack of collapsing glass. Inside Hangar 5, the captured Thunderbolt still waited, its tires half flat, its American stencils visible beneath the faded Balkenkreuz. No one guarded it anymore. When Allied troops reached the airfield, they came not with ceremony but exhaustion. American armor rumbled through the gates, scattering the remnants of the garrison. A young lieutenant from the 9th Army stepped into the hangar and stopped. There, under layers of dust, stood an American airplane wearing German markings. The irony made him laugh once, softly. The war had been a long education, and this was its final lesson. The soldiers moved through the hangars, cataloging what they found: disassembled engines, burned files, incomplete prototypes, rows of captured aircraft stripped to skeletons. In an office littered with broken glass, intelligence officers collected reports stamped streng geheim. Among them was a dossier marked Technische Beurteilung, P-47D. The first page bore a familiar name: Pratt and Whitney R. 2800. The Americans read the German annotations with disbelief. The enemy had analyzed their machine with a thoroughness bordering on devotion. Metallurgical notes, turbo pressure curves, photographs of every rivet. One officer murmured, "They knew more about this engine than most of our own squadrons." Another replied, "And still it didn't help them." Outside, the wind turned pages scattered across the runway. German, English, mathematics, without a country. The era of secrecy had ended. Everything that could be learned was already obsolete. The war had shifted from knowledge to capacity, and capacity had chosen its victor. Far to the west, in a liberated camp on the Baltic coast, 2nd Lieutenant William E. Roach waited for transport home. 2 years had passed since the morning he mistook a German airfield for safety. He was 24 now, leaner, quieter, carrying the kind of calm that only captivity teaches. When he learned that his aircraft still existed, the news reached him as a rumor from a passing guard. "Your machine, Thunderbolt, is in Germany. They fly it." He had smiled then, not with pride but wonder. how a mistake born of exhaustion had become a footnote in a greater story. In June, he stood again on English soil, the same gray wind sweeping across the channel. At Debden Airfield, he met pilots who had joined the 355 after his capture. They spoke of new tactics, long-range escorts, the relentless push into Germany's heart. "We don't run out of gas anymore," one joked. Roach nodded. He didn't mention that somewhere near a burned-out airfield, his old machine had helped teach the enemy that lesson. Meanwhile in Washington, the reports from Rechlin reached the U.S. Army Air Force's Intelligence Division. Analysts studied the German notes with professional detachment. They admired the precision, the engineering respect behind each observation. One margin comment from a German metallurgist became famous among the evaluators. "We are losing not to pilots, but to foundries." It was underlined twice. The Americans understood. The war had proven that courage could not exist without the machinery that sustained it. As Europe rebuilt, Rechlin became rubble and memory. The Soviets dismantled what remained, shipping machinery east. The hangars filled with weeds. Children from nearby villages later played in the wrecks of aircraft that once represented the cutting edge of empires. Among them, the frame of the P-47 Beetle rusted slowly, its story dissolved into rain and soil. Yet its meaning endured, in factories, classrooms, and the quiet pride of men who built rather than flew. Hans-Werner Lärz survived the war as well. He wrote modestly of his experiences, careful to separate admiration from nostalgia. In one interview years later, he was asked which Allied aircraft had impressed him most. He smiled. "The Thunderbolt," he said. "It was not beautiful, but it was honest. It did everything its engineers promised, and it forgave its pilot. That is the highest praise a test pilot can give." Then, after a pause, "It was proof that abundance can be a kind of genius." Historians would echo that sentiment. The P-47's legacy was not defined by its kill count or its silhouette in the skies over Europe, but by what it revealed: that industrial strength could be a moral force when turned toward endurance rather than conquest. The aircraft's design philosophy, overbuild, automate, protect, became the template for the post-war world. Its descendants were not just jets or bombers, but the systems that powered a modern civilization. In museums decades later, visitors would stand before restored Thunderbolts, their aluminum skin gleaming under halogen lights. The placard simple: Republic P-47D Thunderbolt. Pratt and Whitney R. 2800, 2,000 horsepower. Few would know that one such plane had once been the most studied object in the Third Reich. Fewer still would know the name William E. Roach, the young pilot who mistook one airfield for another and changed the course of a nation's understanding of war. But those who looked closely could still see it. The rivet lines straight as factory prayers, the faint scars where paint had been sanded away, the ghost of a black cross beneath the American star. A reminder that even in war, learning travels both directions. The story of the Thunderbolt's capture ended not with glory or tragedy, but with comprehension. Germany learned what industry meant. America learned what endurance required. Between them lay a machine that had outlasted empires. In the end, the Beetle did not fly again. It didn't need to. Its silence at Rechlin spoke loudly enough. The war had begun with the belief that genius could overcome numbers. It ended with the understanding that numbers, multiplied by will and freedom, were genius. And somewhere, in the thin gray light over northern France, a memory still lingers of a lone pilot watching his fuel gauges drop toward empty, gliding toward an airfield that seemed familiar. He could not know that his mistake would become history's most eloquent equation: how one man's surrender revealed the power of a nation that refused to run out of fuel.